Hello, everyone. My name is Kyra Woods, and I'm really thrilled to join you all this evening. I work in the mayor's office here at the city, and I'm really grateful to also be working on our sustainability team. We just wrapped up our 2022 Climate Action Plan, which is the first full update of the city's climate goals since 2008. But a number of you may have also been involved with some of our sustainability work as a city since then. There was a major strategic update and strategic planning effort in the era of like 2011, 2012 that really took Chicago through 2015 with a new set of strategies to reach those goals set in 2008. But now this year, we are really thrilled to set forward a new set of goals that really help build upon those that were initially set, that meet the urgency of the moment now, given the climate crisis, but also really seeks to center community benefits as well. So part of our conversation today will be to go through the climate action plan at a high level. Some of you may be really familiar with the work and others may not. So I'll explain a bit of how we got to where we got to, a sneak peek into the plan. And then I really want to make some space for us to explore this idea of how we exercise transparency while also thinking about the massive amounts of data that can be possible and ways to effectively and efficiently share data. So admittedly, we will not get into the ins and outs of database operations, but hopefully for those of you who are skilled in that way or interested in thinking about how to share and explain large amounts of data in ways that are applicable to our general population here in Chicago, I am curious to build and learn with you. All right, so let's keep going a little bit further. Again, tonight we're going to start with exploring the actual climate action plan. And we are really seeing a moment across the world where cities are taking commitments to climate action with a broader lens than maybe traditional action and agendas typically have. Here in Chicago, as we began this journey of updating our climate action goals, we wanted to ensure that we were asking ourselves, well, how will this directly improve the environment by reducing emissions, but also what is the community benefit that is offered? And how do we center that throughout all of the strategies in the plan? So if you are following along at home or want to open up a new tab, you can explore with us today at chicago.gov/climate action plan. And ultimately, the theme of this work was to equitably invest in community health and climate resilience while reducing Chicago's footprint 62% by 2040. And this value of 62% at this time marker of 2040 was developed through modeling and through some really intense and meaningful discussion with stakeholders. But as we tinkered with a few of the categories and thought about how we go about reaching some of these goals and targets, we said it is not only about the carbon reductions, though that is critically important to address the urgency of the moment, but it is also about ensuring that we are investing in community. And so this is just a brief overview. I know that the text is pretty small, but you'll find this in the full plan online. In essence, again, it's just showing that we are trying to ensure that we center on equity using 4 co-benefits. And you can see these at the top of the page, actually. We would like to ensure that we have economic inclusion and savings, that we reduce pollution burden. We would also like to ensure that we equitably invest in access to critical infrastructure and ensure that we have community health and resiliency, again, threaded throughout the entire plan as we reduce our carbon emissions. We know that these strategies are about ways to think about addressing historic harms, but also ensuring that we create a just and equitable climate future for all Chicagoans. And setting bold targets and goals and keeping to them is one way that we are investing in our future. And so what does it really mean to have equitable climate action, one may ask? But part of that is to ensure that strategies like expanding the urban tree canopy is not simply about putting trees anywhere and not only where they are lacking, but how can we do that with community? And how can we do that in a way that is data informed also? So on the left, you're looking at a map that shows data related to the tree canopy coverage according to census tract across the city. The areas that are in darker green have yeah.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that folks can see your slides.
Sure.
Can you try sharing your screen one more time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Cool, we got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for saying something.
Yeah, of course.
All right. In the interest of time, I will not go through it all again, but I will slowly.
We're sharing links through the chat, and we'll be able to point to the stuff that you referenced previously. So
that's more than okay.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Cameron. So yes, so we are looking here at this map related to our tree canopy coverage. On the left, we have a image based on our census tract that really shows where tree density is the greatest. The areas in darker green show where that coverage is more dense, and in that lighter yellow color, you'll see there is room for some coverage, right? However, when we really zoom in and think about where there is the least amount of coverage, while this gives us a brief look into a bit of where we should go with tree planting, it also allows us to think more critically about how we can do this with community. How do we ensure that we maintain the canopy if we augment in those areas and as we do? But how can we really do this in tandem with community, ensure that there's joint joint meaning making actually for that type of investment, so that there is collective buy-in and that the investment in infrastructure and those benefits is truly meeting the needs of community. Okay, so I figured we could just take a pause, talk high level about how to navigate this report that is kind of dense, admittedly. But I hope that that beginning part really helps to set this stage for how we guided this work. And then let's take a few moments to go over just some like brass tacks of the plan and looking at how to navigate through it for starters. So if you're following along again online, chicago.gov/climate action plan, you'll notice that the top margin and the left margin are navigation tools. I find this pretty helpful, especially if you're using a digital copy. Of course, in print, this doesn't do you much good, but the screen fatigue is real. So on the left navigation panel, you'll see there's a red arrow that indicates what part of the plan you're in. And then on the top margin, you're also able to actually select the number, which corresponds to the pillar of climate strategies that you're looking at. And you'll know where you are, of course, based on which number is highlighted. A few other navigation tools that I think are important to name as you're going through the plan and even thinking about comparing items are these three elements. It was very important to stakeholders and the general public as we sought feedback that we address nature-based solutions also within the plan. More traditional climate action plans frequently focus on just carbon reduction, like how do you prevent more emissions in the future? But it is also important to think about the importance, or excuse me, the value of sequestration, or how do we really draw down, right? The carbon that is in the atmosphere. And so incorporating nature-based solutions with each pillar was a bit of feedback that we got throughout the entire engagement process. And we wanted to be sure that that was woven throughout the plan so that people could see the links between some tech and nature solutions. Co-benefits, this column in the middle, again, these are the co-benefits that I mentioned at the beginning. However, throughout the plan, these are, there's actually a bit of discussion or a guided framework that accompanies each of these categories at the level of strategies. So there are pillars, there are strategies, and then there are actions within the plan. And these co-benefits are at each strategy because it's important to think about how equity really shows up at each of those, that strategic level throughout the plan. And so honestly, these are questions that we are encouraging decision makers and implementers to consider as they are moving that particular strategy forward. And then we also have quotes directly from residents across the city peppered throughout the report as well. Because as a team, we felt that it was very important that people see themselves in the plan in their own words. And so we took quite a bit of time to explore various ways to hear from people, and we wanted to be able to help people see themselves. In addition to climate strategies and mitigation strategies, the plan also has spent some substantial real estate and page coverage to explore some background information, as well as talking about adaptation and resiliency. So as a part of the background, it was really important also to couch the conversation before getting into any of the climate actions. We wanted to preface that conversation with an explanation around climate justice, identifying and honoring the work of local environmental justice groups here in Chicago that are not only leading the conversation locally in the city, but at the state and even federally. We also wanted to take time to contextualize equity. It's a word, equity, at least, is a word that is getting a lot of airtime right now. But what does it mean in this context around climate action? And what does it mean in this context of equitable climate action, right? How we spend our money, how programs are designed, and who they are intended to benefit are all the types of questions that we wanted to scratch the surface of in this section. And so I'm really excited for the ways that we highlighted and offered visuals around redlining and the legacy of policies like that related to real estate or land use. We were able to highlight the work of Chicago and Tanika Johnson and the Folded Map Project. We also were able to make parallels between the tree canopy coverage, heat severity, and energy burden. And these were just, again, ways to help people understand or see some examples of what we mean by inequitable impacts of climate. Furthermore, we spent some time talking about the types of financing that will make these goals possible. Again, that timeline takes us all the way to 2040. We are really grateful for the amount of work and budget space that we have this year and over the next 5 years from local dollars, as well as some federal programs that are going to help us make these goals and targets possible. Lastly, again, adaptation and resiliency is critical because of the fact that we are feeling the impacts of climate change already. So that is a bit of an overview of the plan and what you'll see in it. I also wanted to take a quick moment to say, okay, well, how did we get here? So if you want to hear what those pillars are, we are almost there. But I do find that people have this question, well, how did you come up with these? Are these just copied and pasted from the last plan? Are they informed by other cities' plans? And honestly, there's a mix of that because we would like to build upon some of the best practices that are already in place and improve upon them. But a lot has changed since 2008. And so we have explored and in preparing the plan, we began with researching and analyzing existing Chicago commitments. And this is a snapshot of what's on that list. What you'll see is that there are some plans or reports that are specific to climate, but there are others like Invest Southwest that directly relate to economic development versus a strict climate focus. But we know that's critical as we think about how to maximize and optimize programs, especially those that are investing in communities that have been underserved or under-resourced. So across these plans, we identified 350 actions. We then said, how many of these relate to the decarbonization agenda, right? How do we actually reduce carbon and the production of emission, or reduce our carbon footprint in the city? And of those 161 items, we then said, all right, how do we really refine those to identify those that prioritize those co-benefits around social, health, and economic benefits? And so from there, we established what are 5 pillars that create the climate action plan for 2022, leading us through 2040. So on the left, you'll read the pillar title, and then on the right, you'll see our pillar strategies. So pillar 1 is to increase access to utility savings and renewable energy while prioritizing households. The strategies in this section are to retrofit buildings and to connect communities to renewable energy. Pillar 2 centers around waste reduction. We would like to build more circular economies in order to create jobs and reduce waste. We know that we have to limit our landfilling and keep objects, materials in use and circulation longer to get their full value and before they're actually seen as disposable. Pillar 3 is for all of those who are interested in transportation and the new frontiers that we are embarking upon. Through the Climate Action Plan, we said we would like to develop a robust zero emission mobility network that connects communities and improves air quality. We can do this by making walking, biking, and public transit more viable options for all trips. We would like to increase transit performance and encourage greater transit-oriented development. So how do we have more housing and economic development around bus stops and train stops and other transit-oriented nodes across the city? And then how do we also enable zero-emission transit and fleets, thinking about our bus system, our trains, and all of the other micro-mobility elements that are taking our streets. The 4th pillar relates to driving equitable development of Chicago's clean energy economy and our clean energy future. We are seeing this now. I think this is one of my favorite pictures in the plan because at the bottom of the picture, you can see solar panels on a home, and this isn't right next to the downtown district, right? So I think it's important to think about how do we make renewable energy and distributed energy accessible and affordable for residents across the city. And the 5th pillar relates to strengthening communities and protecting health. This is where this data question is really salient, particularly because the strategies and actions in this pillar don't directly reduce our carbon emissions necessarily, but do really lean into that conversation of adaptation and resiliency. So how can we collect relevant data, enable data-driven decision-making, and enable greater community resiliency? And so this community engagement, like how did we get to these titles and these actions? Honestly, there was such great input that we received from stakeholders beginning last summer and fall, all the way through April when we finished our public engagement period. So we hosted 2 virtual town halls. We had a website, which again, chicago.gov/climate action plan. We had 2 online surveys where people were able to share the priorities that mattered most to them and how they would spend a budget of $100, but of course these budgets are much bigger, but a hypothetical budget. What priorities would you like to see those dollars used? And then we had a public comment period where we released a draft of the report, and we received over 300 written comments and a few voice messages as well. And so of those responses, we were able to really take a look at where the data, like where we got input from, and then also use that to identify where we needed to exert greater effort and outreach. And this is a snapshot of that. Based on our online surveys, we were able to see there were a few pockets where about 10 community areas where we did not receive feedback. The sharing your ward or sharing your neighborhood was an optional question on our survey. And so I do say, this is just based on what people shared. And so on the right, you're looking at a map where the pink areas identify where we did receive feedback. The gray areas indicate where we did not receive feedback. And there's a greater concentration of those neighborhoods on the south side and just a few on the west side. But once we took a snapshot of this mid-public engagement on that timeline, we were able to reach out to partners that we had in these 10 areas. And eventually we did get 4 responses, or we were able to get responses from 4 other community areas that were where we had not previously received feedback. And so having tools like this along the way have been helpful to help us fine tune our strategy and, also I think meaningfully engage partners to ensure that their voices are being heard as well, and that we are ensuring that that is the case and not just taking chances. Another thing I wanted to share about the demographic information that we collected and used to gauge how we were doing in terms of our outreach. We wanted to know a bit more about housing and how people lived in the city that were responding to the surveys. And this is important because as we think about strategies related to energy or waste management, there are different policies that will be necessary for those living in a single family home versus someone living in a 2-flat or even a high rise. And so it's important that the benefits of these types of actions and transitions truly reach those who may not have the greatest access to investments or financial opportunities, as well as thinking about those who may be experiencing some burdens to a greater degree, such as energy burden, right? If more of your paycheck is going to keeping your lights on or basic needs, such as your utilities, it's important that we prioritize those groups when we're thinking about energy efficiency programs because they are in greater need for that. And so we were trying to make sure that we were keeping a pulse reading throughout the process. And this word cloud on the right gives us just a snapshot of some of the words that came up often in the written feedback from the surveys. And so building, transportation, justice, infrastructure are just a few words, clearly bikes and bike lanes too, that came out of this process and allowed our team to then say, okay, based on the strategies and models and research, how can we ensure that we are selecting and refining the strategies in a way that is reflective of what Chicagoans say that they want? In the interest of time, I won't go through this slide in great detail. This is actually also on our website. It's a bit of a feedback loop to say, this is what we heard from you. And within the plan also, we included that graphic that allowed people to prioritize where they wanted to spend their money. And we shared a bit about how we changed pieces of the plan to reflect that feedback. And so we heard a lot about addressing parking minimums. And so we actually added a new action altogether to the plan that wasn't in the draft initially. If you go down to the 4th row, increase ambitions for community-wide composting. This is a major piece that a lot of people were very excited to see, but we know that there's a lot of work that will be required. And so the feedback helped us change the percentages and targets of a particular goal, and in some cases allowed us to go back to our sister agencies or departments to say, hey, we need something here. There's a lot of momentum for this. We know this is an opportunity to set bold and creative solutions for the climate future. And it allowed us to really come up with some strong wins. Okay, so I know that we are pushing time just a little bit, so I'm going to just keep trucking along. This is pretty much the end of what's in the plan. But I did want to take a slightly closer look at what we mean by exercising transparency while working through this element of excessive data. If you are keeping track of the pillars, right, of energy and material management, as well as resiliency and adaptation, you can imagine that that is a lot of different sources to pull from. And as we think about what equity means with each of those as well, it becomes a bit of a sprawling issue. Like, how do we, what data is most important to share and with residents who are looking to be a part of solutions, who are looking to get engaged either with a local community group or something led by the city, or for those who simply want to know how are we doing without having to rely on an article in 5 years to do a checkup on the city. Transparency and accountability was one of the or two of the greatest issues that were raised in our stakeholder working groups, as well as with our town halls. People said, well, how will we know how we're doing? And I think this speaks to a gap in some of that data transparency, but it's a lot that we're talking about pulling together. And I'm very curious to know and learn with you all through the Q&A and, communication later about how we can do this. So here are just some of the equity considerations that you'll see throughout the CAP. Not in these exact words, but again, these co-benefits and these equity considerations are at each strategy. The types of priorities that we were hearing, again, transparency and accountability, reforesting the city, right? So that's in nature-based solutions that people wanted to see, zoning reform, and needed, diversity of rental spaces and housing options. We were seeing a lot around ownership and also protected bike lanes. So I'm just rattling these off to share. These are the very diverse elements of issues that people want to keep track of. Also, maybe the third most popular topic was, how are we going to pay for this? And gratefully, we're in this moment where there is significant, and definitely in comparison to the previous administration, but there's significant momentum around funding opportunities for what we know to be critical infrastructure investments and how those can be used to not only bring economic opportunity to communities, but can be used to really push our climate goals forward. So carbon capture demonstration projects, thinking about renewable energy and energy efficiency for our schools, skills training, those types of elements and resources as well, people want to know about. And then there's a host of decision makers that need to be involved. While the climate action plan sets the tone and direction and level of ambition for some of these areas, we are working in tandem with our departments and sister agencies, such as the parks, the Chicago Park Districts and our public school system, to actually achieve these goals. And so what becomes clear is that there are these various plans and platforms for impact. It's to city council, it's formal commissions, it's to potentially setting up advisory groups, different budgets and different seasons for departments or sister agencies. If it's not housed here in the city proper and dealing with either the mayor's office or city council, that means that you'll have to negotiate with the board potentially of a different sister agency. And so again, lots of different spaces for information. And when people have answered the question, well, how would you like this shared? Resource guides come up, websites always come up, and this is the big one, a database. And I'm really curious to explore this, and we'll be working on this for some time as we move through implementation. But what structure of a database would be helpful? Is it really a database that would be helpful as people want to be connected to resources, see progress for these various categories, and how can we sync sets of information that are frequently pretty disparate in the types of platforms that different agencies or departments use. So we are exploring this piece right now. How can we both be transparent, but recognizing that we are building systems as we go right now. And that is going to be a major part of the implementation, accountability, and transformation of this work as well. So I'll stop there in interest of time. I'd love to be sure to leave space for questions and answers. And I hope that this has been insightful to the process of creating the climate action plan and where we're going next.
All right. Thank you for the insightful presentation here. And we'll start with a few questions. So let me switch here to the questions. Okay. So our first question is, what parts of the plan have changed most over the course of its development and with the community feedback sessions?
Sure. It's a good question. The element actually related to climate justice and contextualizing equity, that was not actually a part of the draft. We initially honed in on the mitigation strategies for the draft in order to give people a smaller slice of things to work with and to try to narrow that feedback that we were getting. And so that feedback allowed us to go, again, internally as a team, but then also externally with departments to negotiate, thresholds and, levels of ambition. But I would say largely that whole background section wasn't there. And so I think that's the easiest answer in terms of what has changed. As a part of the mitigation strategies, I think it was really important that we explore language. There was a lot of conversation internally and with advocates about our transportation language. And so vehicle miles traveled was not something that we initially had in the plan, but people and experts and advocates said, like, that is kind of important and something that we should explore using within the plan more often. Having a concrete number around concrete barriers and other types of protected bike lanes and permanent bus lanes. That was a huge point where in the draft we were still working on that, and we were able to really say, no, there's a lot of energy here, and this is the level of ambition we'd like to set as a city, particularly by 2040. And so those types of things are small, but I think really important in terms of what it means to be setting climate policy now. And then lastly, I'm sorry, the fifth pillar was a ball of clay for the draft. And we had refined that through the stakeholder engagement process a bit, but we knew that it needed some more substance, not just bells and whistles. So actually, suggestions that were in the adaptation and resilience section moved to pillar 5, and we were able to develop, build up the buy-in from departments and other stakeholders to actually put them in the pillar of number 5 rather than being a separate section. So those are the areas that I would say have most critically changed.
Awesome. Thank you. I think Michael will ask the next question.
Yeah, thanks. The next question is, what is one of the first impacts residents might see from the climate action plan? Is there a first piece of legislation or an investment?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because I do think that this moment has a lot going on for it in terms of investments that are already on its way. And so even before the climate action plan, there was a lot. We had to pass our 2022 budget. And so there were already conversations around our tree canopy coverage that were moving forward. I think that has had a lot of visibility, and that is something that you can look forward to. You may be in a neighborhood where you may see a door hanger that is sharing the fact that you can request a tree for your parkway in front of your home, and that we are trying to think more critically about how to do that and getting the word out about that. That's one element. I think as a part of our exploration of accessible and affordable renewable energy, you'll also see more conversation around energy procurement as well, and thinking about what decarbonization will look like. And that's something that, again, kind of was already started before the climate action plan, but we're in a place where we have some more momentum, and having bold climate targets allow that can really be impactful when it comes to applying for grants or for other funding, because we say we have the momentum, we have the buy-in, we have a secured strategy, and we're in the development of a strategy. And so we can begin funneling money to programs like energy efficiency work or distributed generation for anchor institutions and community, to demonstrate the importance and benefit of having access to renewable and storage.
Thank you. I'll ask the next question. So you spoke about the term equity and considering what it really means in context.
Sure.
Did your team find that organizations across the city were did you find that organizations across the city working on climate have consistent language around terms like equity or environmental justice, et cetera? Can you give us a sense of sort of how folks are thinking about these terms?
Sure. Like, were we all on the same page? I think that what is very clear is that you can never overemphasize, and like it is important to co-develop or have a shared understanding of what those words mean. So I do think that we were in the same ballpark. I think what is clear across the board is like people's level of commitment to those things. And I think based on, just like what seat you're in at the table, whether you're a community group or a government representative or an advocate, right? Like the lengths or the distance that you would like to see that implemented or actually achieved, that may look different. Sometimes the strategies look different, but I do think we have a lot of, we were pretty much on the same page. And I would credit a lot of that actually to having those spaces where frontline leaders or community-based organizations were there to speak for themselves about what that meant. And I think there was enough respect and understanding in the room about that type of deference to meaning making in that way. I would also say that given the state legislation related to the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, that had a lot of traction already in Chicago. And I think was, of course, beyond Chicago, but for the parties that we were convening or the audience members that were engaged in those town halls, I think there was a familiarity with the principle and in this context. So that definitely helped as well. So people were ready to say, okay, what does that mean for workforce development? Not just, where the trees go potentially.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question here is, how do you think responsible management of the Great Lakes could drive positive benefits to residents?
Mm-hmm. How can responsible management of the Great Lakes provide benefits for residents?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are layers to that question. So I'm thinking about, actual like water quality, but also, access to those spaces and the, protection of those spaces as we think about our lakefront erosion as well. So I think that there are those soft benefits related to like well-being and access that are important to capture and think about, as well as the, for the lack of a better phrase, the like preventing pollution of those sources, of those natural resources and the adjacent natural resource, connected to the actual Great Lakes. So, and of course, then that deals with like land use issues and zoning as well, and preventing, and of course, enforcement to ensure that we're protecting those areas and developing them responsibly. So I think that, I think that has major benefits, particularly given how important it is to have a freshwater source so close. It's critically important that we protect it for, for generations to come.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask the next one here. So there's a lot of environmental justice activity going on in Chicago, sometimes around sort of flashpoint, development projects or community impacts. How does the city consider its role in balancing community needs and economic priorities?
It's there. it's critically important, and I think that's why having just really sharp team members to try to optimize both of those things is important. It means for a very rich discussion, but it does. We are also an administration that does believe in that type of historical reckoning, and as we embark upon our second year of healing, it's important that we think about those legacy harms as well. I think given the COVID-19 pandemic, we are again in a tough position where maybe the pressures of economic development feel very strong from a lot of different stakeholders. This is not just a conversation about downtown, but people are looking to be employed again. People are looking to stabilize their families or thinking about long-term health concerns, right? So in many ways, the conversation hasn't changed in terms of how those things sometimes feel in tension, but I think we recognize that we live in a time of concentric crises, and we do have to find solutions that keep communities safe, do not continue to perpetuate harm, but also position us in a way to grow and offer those opportunities to communities. And so I do think that we recognize that it's critical to facilitate space and convenings for people, for residents to have those types of conversations with one another, but also with us as the city and other stakeholders that are involved. But I wholeheartedly agree that, and I know team members here recognize that that's important to we know that that is our role to appropriately weight those two issues, and that is not even inclusive of all the others that are also in consideration too. Workforce development, again, thinking about public safety and how these issues really are experienced by residents is not siloed, right? A community feels that cumulative impact. And so that, even as a phrase and as a concept, is really, I think, becoming more used as we think about how to have impactful policy that is holistic as well. So I'm really looking forward to thinking about and seeing what more work comes out of the We Will Chicago process, or the greater city planning process. And I only bring that up because while the climate action plan focuses on our sustainability agenda, We Will Chicago is thinking about all of those categories, ranging from lifelong learning to infrastructure and transportation and environment and energy, among others. And so that economic development and land use and zoning, those arcs are going to be also covered in the not the climate action plan, but in our city planning process as well. So I would keep my eye on that process and get engaged if you'd like to influence it as well.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess kind of related to something you said in the answer to the last question too about COVID and kind of economic impacts of that. I guess more broadly, how much did COVID impact the plan, both in terms of logistics of coordinating stakeholders, but then also in terms of kind of pillars and strategies themselves for example, the Protect Health pillar?
Yeah, a lot, particularly as it relates to engagement. So in some of those early conversations with our stakeholders, like that, our initial stakeholder feedback group, there was a lot of emphasis on having digital equity ultimately. And I know you've got an upcoming talk about that too. So stay tuned. But as we have I think COVID-19 helped to amplify, right, those disparities around our digital equity and gaps there around economics, as well as the geographic distribution of that, right? And so we were really excited about having some of our partners host conversations in person. We worked with Muse Community Design team to help develop like a digital toolkit, as well as like a low tech option as well. And then we weren't able to use the low tech option because of Omicron. And so it definitely put a wrench in it because we know that it's those in-person conversations that can be really fruitful and really help people engage on a topic rather than just feeling they're clicking boxes. We know that for some people, the clicking boxes approach is fine as well. So it definitely changed our community engagement strategy, or at least the execution of it. But I'm proud of us for committing to that work. We created, again, the high tech and low tech option in 5 languages to think about language access. And then our town halls, we had a Spanish interpreter as well as an ASL interpreter for those spaces as well. So really just trying to lean as far in as we could to ensure that folks who were joining digitally had access to that. And then we relied on, again, those partners to disseminate information. Our community engagement team shared with folks. We shared with the networks involved with Invest Southwest to really simply say, like, you belong in this conversation too, even if you don't call it sustainability, or even if you think you have nothing to do with it, just like come along if you're interested. And so that had to live in a far more digital space. As it relates to the actual metrics, data frequently, especially citywide data, isn't always real time. And so we know that we're going to have to update some of these numbers just in a couple of years once the actual COVID, like 2020 and 2021 numbers roll in. So a lot of most of our metrics and benchmarks are like kind of go up to 2019. And we recognize and even say throughout the plan, like, that things are different, right? So I think the number one like action related that saw an impact like this and will have to be toyed with over time is related to increasing ridership on CTA. Before the pandemic, we needed to increase ridership, right? Increasing ridership after the pandemic is a whole different ball of wax, and that is, I think, one way where the strategies to achieve that goal will be different. But we did say, here is where we're still looking to get in terms of our actual target.
All right, thank you. I think we have about time for about 2 more questions, if that's okay with.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so I think this next one is sort of related. I'm not personally as aware of the details on it, but I'll read the question. And what happens when policy decisions contradict the climate action plan goals? For example, the plan has the goal to increase divvy bikes and shared micromobility trips 30% by 2030, but divvy just removed the equity boundary for electric bikes and raise rates. How do we bring decisions more in line with plan goals?
That's a really good question. And I think it does speak to, it's a good question. And it speaks to the need for internal coordination, right? And then also, I think it's important to continue to have spaces like this and amplify what the goals are so that we can also have external accountability as well. And I think that's just important to ensuring that we are moving this forward. I think while, it's important sometimes always to look at the big picture as often as possible, but while Divvy may have removed those boundaries, they've also had some significant, there are other places where for other tiers of ratepayers that their fees significantly dropped also. And so thinking about the geographies where that applies, or conversations around what to do with our CTA rates, which right now are reduced and really affordable. I don't mean to generalize it, but if you haven't seen the new rates, you can get a 30-day pass for like $75 these days, but I think we're still playing with how to ensure that there is equity there. And so while it may not look like it may look like it's contradicting at one level, but if it's actually enabling other groups to participate and have access to some of these benefits or resources and services, I think there is sometimes that trade-off that is important, because the big picture actually looks like bringing more people along in order to even out the playing field a little bit. At least that's my response with that particular example in mind. I think broadly, though, it is a concern, and I think a part of government work is definitely understanding those competing interests around different areas, and that synergy is necessary. That it was really important for us to work with departments throughout this process so that we could all begin to internalize some of these strategies and goals, so that there are fewer instances of that happening. And sometimes things are kind of time bound, like we're going to do this for a certain period of time, and then we're going to have to shift gears or double check where we are, the progress we've made, ultimately evaluate that decision and then shift gears from there. So it is tough at times. And I think, again, right now, where a lot of those various crises feel like they are squeezing us all, it's important to think about how to stitch them together as we can.
Great, thank you. So I think last question here. How does the city communicate or work with other cities that have ambitious climate plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Chicago belongs to a network called C.R.U.D, and that is a global network of cities that allows us to have that type of communication, or at least be in network and in relationship with some of those cities. There's also the National Forum of USDN, which it's a network for sustainability directors and leaders. And that is a great network for, again, not just conversation, but joint learning and sharing resources and workshopping, even to say, okay, like, did you have about this trade-off, or about these things that seem like they're in dissonance? How were you able to forge a path forward? Or I see that that's the issue, that's the final decision your city made in this final plan, but what pieces were on the cutting floor that maybe were negotiated? And so that forum, I think, is also really helpful. And I think those types of questions are important, because it's easy to maybe pull a bunch of reports and compare them, but following up with cities to say, how is that actually going in implementation is really the rub. Because that's where that's where things either happen or don't. And that's where a lot of learning can happen too. So gratefully, the city of like Chicago, people are pretty welcoming if we make a call or if they call us. And I think this space around sustainability and energy, environment, climate is one where people recognize there's a lot of shared learning. And if we can help one another either leapfrog or think critically and more expansively about how to have transformation as we link in economic development, social healing, as well as our climate goals, like, it feels really good that the energy seems to be going in that way. I may be biased, but in my work so far, that has been the case. And I know that the residents of Chicago who were involved in making this plan a reality are really asking for that from us as well.
All right, well, we'll end there. And thank you so much for your presentation. Thanks to the city for the work on the climate plan. And we'll look forward to following along as things progress.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. Michael, I got to look to you and see if I'm forgetting things that we have next. I think I'm supposed to mention the post Zoom. So looking over at you here.
Yep. Yeah, I think Josh is putting that up now on the screen. So those of you who are joining our post-presentation Zoom, the bit.ly link is on there, and hopefully somebody will be posting it in the YouTube chat here too. And then I'll also go on Slack. So hop over there.
All right. And then I think we'll send folks off and say thanks for joining us, and go forth
and hack.